factors that were already taking place. China has seen a decline in its working age population, so all other things being equal, that leads to slower economic growth. They went through a period of excessive investment a decade ago, and that yielded excess capacity, which has had a negative impact on their business investment. But the trade war has also contributed to the economic slowdown. It certainly hurt overall trade. Exports to the United States have fallen sharply, although exports to the rest of the world have increased. The trade war has had a chilling effect on business investment in China. And so the Chinese economy has slowed, and the Chinese government has responded by undertaking some fiscal and monetary stimulus measures to try to halt the slowdown, although it's only been moderately successful. Going forward, I expect in 2020 even slower economic growth in China than took place in 2019. And I think the Chinese government is going to focus not simply on dealing with the trade war with the U.S., but trying to find other sources of growth. So China has been attempting to liberalize trade with other countries, even as it imposes tariffs on the U.S., and China has continued to try to stimulate domestic demand in order to move the economy away from excess dependence on exports.
Talk a little bit about the liberalization of trade policies with other countries. Who is China looking at? What are their biggest sort of options on that front?
Well, there are a couple of areas. One is China has organized a free trade agreement among Pacific Rim nations called the RCEP, or Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And over time, that is going to come into effect, and that will involve a reduction in trade barriers between China, Japan, Southeast Asia, and potentially India if they decide to join, which they haven't so far. And China has also looked to liberalize trade with Western Europe, especially the European Union. And China has actually cut tariffs on countries other than the United States, even as it's increased tariffs on the U.S. So I think China sees trade as an important source of growth for their economy. But given that you're dealing with a country with 1.4 billion people, it's a huge domestic market. And I think they're looking to boost domestic demand, especially consumer demand, after a prolonged period in which their economy has been excessively dependent on exports and business investment.
You mentioned the European Union. I want to circle back around on that because the U.S. and the EU have some burgeoning disputes as well. Update us on that one.
Well, there are a number of areas of conflict. One is that the WTO made a ruling about
the World Trade Organization.
Yes. They made a ruling about trade in aerospace products and actually gave both sides the ability to impose punitive tariffs in retaliation for subsidies on aerospace products. And the U.S. has taken that to heart and imposed some tariffs. The U.S. has been angry at France for a digital services tax and has threatened very substantial tariffs. And the U.S. has also threatened to impose tariffs on all automotive imports, but basically it would primarily be focused on German automotive imports. And that actually has had a chilling effect on investment in the German automotive sector because there's uncertainty about what kind of trading environment those companies are going to face going forward. So there is tension, at the very least, between the U.S. and Europe. It hasn't yet resulted in huge tariffs, like in the case of China, but it has created a considerable degree of uncertainty, which I think has had a negative impact on business investment on both sides of the Atlantic.
Do we have anything historical that we can look back on and say, well, we've been, close to this kind of situation with our European allies? Or is this something we haven't really weathered before?
This is unique in the post-war era. You may recall that at the time of the Great Depression in the early 1930s, the U.S. Congress did pass the famous Smoot-Hawley tariff, which dramatically increased U.S. tariffs on imports primarily from Europe. And although it didn't cause the Great Depression, it substantially exacerbated the Great Depression. And it did lead to substantial retaliation by other countries. In the post-World War II era, we've mostly seen a period of trade liberalization led by the United States, which created most of the global institutions that promoted liberalization of the movement of goods and capital and people around the world. So what's taking place now is a very substantial change from what's generally been the case over the last 70 years.
So what is the impact then, do you anticipate, if this escalates more between the United States and the EU? What happens in the U.S. and what happens in the European economy?
Well, I think it could be quite negative. When you impose restrictions on trade, it increases costs, it increases prices, it reduces consumer spending power, it slows economic growth, and it has the effect of stymieing business investment. And even though we haven't seen a huge degree of restrictions on trade across the Atlantic, the uncertainty is already having a negative impact. So if this trade war worsens, it could have a further negative impact on both economies. The Eurozone economy has already just skirted recession, and especially Germany, where the economy slowed down to a crawl. And in large part, that was due to this trade war. The U.S. economy has also slowed down in large part due to the trade war, although the U.S. economy continues to grow at a reasonably good pace. Both economies have seen a sort of bifurcation where exports and investment have slowed or declined, while consumer spending has continued to grow at a reasonably good pace. And the question now is whether the weakness in investment and exports will spill over into the consumer sector, or to put it another way, whether the weakness in industry will spill over into services. There is already some evidence that this is happening, not enough yet to push either side into recession, but I think there is a risk that this trade war, and not just the U.S.-EU trade war, but the overall environment of global trade wars could push the global economy into recession.
So we have this sort of global environment of trade war, but every time that a move is made and someone's hurt, someone else benefits. Who is benefiting, even if it's, a smaller country? Who's benefiting from what's happening between the U.S. and China, or the U.S. and the EU?
Well, in the case of the U.S.-China trade war, some companies that assemble final goods in China have chosen to divert that assembly to other countries in Southeast Asia, primarily Vietnam. And so we've seen very strong growth of the Vietnamese economy and strong inbound investment into Vietnam as a consequence of the trade war.
Okay. So Vietnam, any others?
Not really. I think what we've seen is the trade war reverberate to other countries. So if you look at Asia, for example, China is at the center of a network of supply chains where many components are made in countries in Southeast Asia or Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, and then exported to China for final assembly, and then goods are exported from there to the U.S. or Europe or elsewhere. Because of the uncertainty about trade, because of this disruption of supply chains, we've seen negative consequences for many of those other economies in East Asia. Some are handling it better than others, but on balance, it's been a negative for most of them. And then if you look at other emerging countries around the world, particularly those that sell commodity products to China, Chinese imports of those products has slowed down as a consequence of the trade war, and it has hurt those countries. But again, there are some winners. As I mentioned earlier, because of the Chinese tariffs on U.S. farm products, there's been a diversion of trade to South America. So to some extent, Brazil and Argentina have benefited from that. But on balance, if the global economy slows overall because of the trade war, those countries will suffer as well.
Okay. Take out your crystal ball, 2020. What are the big thoughts you want to leave us with for what what we should be looking for this year?
Well, there are a couple of unanswered questions. One question is, will the trade war get worse? Will it remain the same? Or will there be an easing of the trade war? My expectation is that it will mainly remain the same and mainly continue to have some negative consequences to the global economy. Another big question is, will there be some fiscal stimulus in Europe to offset the weakness of the European economy. And I don't know the answer to that, but Europe overall has slowed down substantially, in part due to the trade war. The European Central Bank has eased monetary policy, but by its own admission, that might not be sufficient, and many analysts have called for fiscal stimulus on the part of those countries that have fiscal space, like Germany or the Netherlands, but it's not clear if that will happen. And in the U.S., one of the big questions is how the Federal Reserve will act in the face of headwinds from the trade wars and still low inflation, but an extraordinarily tight labor market that has the potential to cause an acceleration of wages that would be inflationary. So the Fed has the choice to leave monetary policy unchanged, ease policy, or even tighten policy, depending on what happens. So these are some of the factors that are likely to drive where we go in 2020.
Ira Kalish is Deloitte's chief global economist. This is The Press Room, and I'm Tanya Ott. We're on Twitter at Deloitte Insight, no S. And I'm on Twitter at Tanya Ott and the number 1. That is TANYAOTT and then the number 1. We'll have another podcast in 2 weeks, so make sure you check back. Or better yet, you can subscribe to the podcast. It's free, and you can have the latest episode delivered straight to your device. It's that easy. And when you download the Deloitte Insights app, you can get all of our podcasts, plus lots of other news and information right there. Search for Deloitte Insights in the App Store of your choice. This podcast is produced by Deloitte. The views and opinions expressed by podcast speakers and guests are solely their own and do not reflect the opinion of Deloitte. This podcast provides general information and is not intended to constitute advice or services of any kind. For additional information about Deloitte, go to deloitte.com/about.
In an age where there's so much change and uncertainty and disruption, there's more of a need for leadership now than there ever was before.
Talking about digital is not enough. Thinking about digital is not enough. Action is what's necessary.
Before we start talking about who's going to do work and how it's done and all the rest, what is work? What should it be?
Today in the Press Room, we take a listen back to some of our most popular conversations of 2019. I'm Tanya Ott, and before we get going on this Best Of episode, I want to encourage you to subscribe to the podcast if you have not already done it. That way you're going to know right away when we've got a new episode that we've dropped, and you won't have to go hunting for it. You can just set it and forget it. Okay, now that the business is out of the way, for this last episode of the year, I thought we'd listen back to some of the conversations we've had this year about two really big topics: the meaning of work and digital technology. I started one of the conversations with a story. Years ago, when my daughters were younger, they went through this phase, it was probably during middle school, when we were running to the store all of the time to buy duct tape. But not your father's duct tape. I'm talking tie-dye, rainbow metallic, cheetah print, you name it. They would cut it up, they'd fold it like origami, one layer after another, crafting bracelets and wallets and even some small purses that they could give to friends and, of course, keep some for themselves. So I'm pretty sure that the company that invented duct tape during World War II could have never imagined a bunch of 13-year-olds turning it into fashion. But as we all know today, duct tape's got a lot of uses.
Well, it's a waterproof tape.
Right,
so
right.
That
a
was
thick
used
waterproof tape that's used, and it was originally green, and because it was waterproof, they called it duct tape. And then over the years, after the war, it began to be used in construction and used to tie together air ducts, and so hence it changed to gray, and we started calling it duct tape.
If you're anything like me, you can use it for just about any repair purpose in the house. And there's actually a Wikipedia page on duct tape that looks at all sorts of different and unusual uses for duct tape. So they used it to fix helicopters in the Vietnam War. There's actually some medical research on duct tape as a wart remedy, which was news to me.
Hi, I'm Ann Phillips, and I lead our research on digital transformation in Deloitte's Center for Integrated Research.
And I'm Jerry Kane. I am a professor of information systems at Boston College and the director of the Shea Center for Entrepreneurship. I'm also the guest editor for digital business at MIT Sloan Management Review.
For several years now, Jerry and Ann have conducted an annual survey of business leaders around the world to find out how digital is going in their shops. They've now got more than 20,000 survey responses and 100 interviews, so a whole lot of data. And it all feeds a new book they've written called The Technology Fallacy: How People Are the Real Key to Digital Transformation. I sat down with them to talk about it, starting with duct tape.
The whole point was when you come in and you think there's only one possible application of technology, it's like saying there's one right use of duct tape. It just doesn't make any sense.
Right. And part of it is discovering along the way how to actually use that technology. So sometimes you might buy a technology and you may have a sense for how you might use it strategically, but it's in the experimentation, it's in the use of that technology that you begin to discover new ways of using it.
Let's move this from tape, which is, very analog. Let's move it to the digital. And one of the tools that a lot of us use in lots of different ways, both personally and in our business life, is a tool like Twitter. And it's been used a lot of different ways by a lot of different companies. And I think that speaks to what you're talking about, Ann. Can you give us sort of the overview of, what Twitter was perhaps originally intended for, but how companies then started figuring out some really good use cases for them?
I really call Twitter the digital duct tape because it's this data stream from customers that companies are figuring out all sorts of different ways to use it. Traditionally, we think of it as an opportunity for a company to get their brand message out. One of the case studies we use in the book was KLM Airlines. Is they really use Twitter as a solution to deal with a crisis in the midst of the 2011 Icelandic volcano eruption. So basically all their flights were down. They had no way to communicate effectively to masses of customers. So then they began to turn to Twitter as a way to sort of begin to get this huge network back on track. Once they started using it in that purpose, they realized it was a great customer service tool. They used it for lost and found. So if you gone through the gate at security and you left your iPad back on the plane, you could tweet KLM and they would have a gate agent bring it back out to you because then they could go back through security. And then there are all sorts of other examples from companies. T-Mobile used data, basically monitored Twitter to see what people hated about their biggest competitors. And that's what led to their uncarrier strategy. So what people disliked was their contracts. And so T-Mobile said, well, we can be the uncarrier. We're not going to do contracts. The healthcare provider Kaiser Permanente used it to track what people disliked about organizations. And it turned out parking was a huge issue. And they could actually use the geotags to figure out what facilities people were most upset with and where they could step in. So it creates this data stream of real-time information that companies can figure out different ways to leverage that for competitive advantage that are very different than just, hey, let's tweet our brand message out over and over and over.
And Tanya, I think the point is that, social media was not created with these intentions in mind. So nobody created these tools and said, this is how we're going to use it. We're going to use it for customer service. We're going to use it to really get a sense for what customers want and their preferences. That was not the original intention of the technology. So it's the idea that the technology gets released and people start to use it and they start to use it in interesting ways. And then the technology continues to evolve as people begin to find different ways to use it.
Now, technology can also create the opportunity to work differently within your own company. And you write about one company that used technology to basically, I guess, create a database of experts within their own company. Before I have you tell me about that technology and the hidden value in it for the company, explain why it is a company felt that it needed to do this in the first place. Didn't they already know who their content experts were within their company?
Well, I mean, there's a very famous saying from, I believe, the CEO of Hewlett-Packard. If only HP knew what HP knew, we'd be 3 times more productive. And so there is this concept that many organizations don't know what knowledge they have in their own 4 walls. They don't know what knowledge resides in the employees' heads. And then sometimes the employees don't even know that the knowledge they possess is actually valuable. When these digital platforms are able to surface this knowledge and make it more accessible to others in the organization, it can really have a significant performance impact.
How were they able to surface this? Like, how did the tool work?
Well, I mean, there are a couple of different examples, I think, in the book. So one is research from my colleague, Paul Leonardi at University of California, Santa Barbara. And he studied Discover Financial Services. And they had a social media platform where the employees would tweet out or would share information online. And he did a before and after study. And basically, by being able to look at this stream of information that people were sharing, they increased their ability to know who knew what in the organization by something like 70%. What was really interesting about that is that when they were asked what they learned, they said, oh, we didn't learn anything. It didn't make a difference, even though he had the data to say otherwise. We have another active research project with a large professional services firm, a very similar sort of process where we're mining the electronic data that people are normally contributing and making that expertise available to others. And what we found was that not only did consultants increase their hourly revenue or their billable revenue by about 5% across the organization once they adopted this tool, it disproportionately affected people who had previously been locked out of the organization or a bit marginalized, namely junior employees in terms of rank and tenure, and women. All performed disproportionately better as a result of adopting this tool. Last but not least, the example we use in this book is a large chemical company did this, and they, on one project team, they made their people stop using email and start using this collaboration platform. And they found it increased the productivity of their team by about 25% because it reduced the effects of turnover. So when somebody left, if they only communicated via email, all that knowledge was lost. When they communicated on a digital platform and somebody else came to take over, they could get up to speed much more quickly. So it's that collaborative side of technology that really, new types of collaboration that it enabled.
Interesting. Each year, you both conduct a survey of company leaders where you report how they think their company is doing digitally. And then you sort of rate the companies by their level of digital maturity. Walk us through that continuum from the early stage companies to the digitally mature companies in terms of how they're finding and leveraging these sort of hidden advantages in the technologies that they deploy.
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked that because we noticed that early stage companies use digital tools differently. Namely, they typically start off by using it to improve customer engagement and interaction. And then by the time you get to digitally maturing organizations, they're actually using it for much more than that. And they're using it not only to engage with their customers, but to improve efficiency and also to innovate and to transform and create new business models. And that's ultimately where the value lies, is in thinking how you can do business differently.
And I think another important follow-up point on this is and this is really the core thesis of the book, it's not just how they use technology that's different. Their leadership styles are different. Their talent retention models are different. Their organizational structure and culture are very different. Digital maturity from an organizational perspective is not just how you use technology. It's how you reorient your entire organization to be able to compete more effectively in a digital world. And those reorientations may or may not actually have much to do with technology. Yes, digitally mature companies use technology differently, but they do a whole lot of other things differently as well.
If you've listened to this podcast before, you've probably heard me say some version of, this is the podcast about the issues and ideas that are important to your business today. Well, one of the biggest issues we're talking about these days is what work is going to look like in 10, 15, or even 50 years from now. How will technologies like artificial intelligence and automation change the way we work? What kinds of jobs aren't going to exist anymore? My guests today say before you start worrying about who's going to be doing the work and how it's going to be done, you need to stop and ask a more fundamental question.
What is work?
That's John Hagel.
Well, I'm the founder and co-chairman of the Deloitte Center for the Edge. The Center for the Edge is a research center that is focused on identifying emerging business opportunities that should be on the CEO's agenda but are not, and we do the research to persuade them to put it on the agenda.
My other guest is Maggie Wool.
I lead research on future of work and learning and human potential for the Center for the Edge.
Our belief is that there is an opportunity and a need for a fundamental shift in how we define work for people. And it has to do at a very high level with the notion of moving from work that typically is tightly specified, highly standardized, routine tasks to work that is about addressing unseen problems and opportunities to create more value. Very different conceptions of what work should be, and at the risk of overgeneralizing, we would say most work in most institutions today around the world is in that former category of tightly specified, standardized tasks.
Yeah, I mean, I think I go to work at 8 o'clock in the morning. I come home at 5 at night. I pretty much know what my day is going to look like. I mean, that's a job, right? That's work. But you're saying, Maggie, that that's not exactly maybe what work should be.
Yeah, work that is laid out and predefined and what we talk about as being routine, that is the stuff that not just now being automated, it's been being automated for years in various forms of, whether that's robotics or computer programs behind the scenes. But things that are predefined and very standardized can be done by machines. And so, I think it's just the last couple of years have really started to put a finer point on it is for humans, what is the work we do? And it's really starting to do the stuff that we want to do, that we're good at doing, understanding other people, thinking creatively, and problem solving, the stuff that used to have to kind of fill in around the gaps when we were spending our days doing really routine tasks. So it is definitely a mindset shift, as well as an actual shift of how time is spent and what the expectations are.
It's a lot of shifting. You write at the top of your article, in the age of artificial intelligence, the answer to a more optimistic future may lie in redefining work itself. But embedded in that statement, John, is this idea that even though we've been assured that automation is, it's going to automate some processes and free up workers to focus more on rewarding tasks, there still is this huge concern amongst a lot of people that I talk to about what the future is going to look like. I hear people saying, they're worried about losing their jobs to robots. And the question would be, why wouldn't they be, given that, a lot of companies have responded to competitive pressures by rolling out cost-cutting measures, which often include eliminating positions and asking people to do more with less?
Yeah, I think that's the key challenge, and frankly, our belief is fears are justified. If work is tightly specified, standardized tasks, and if the focus of the institution is on cost-cutting, yes, all that work is going to get taken away, and we're going to lose our jobs. But again, our view is the missed opportunity is, what if we took that capacity that's now been freed up, that should have actually never been done by people to begin with, that's work that machines can do much better than we can, and refocus those people on creating more and more value for the institution. Now we're suddenly turning it into a situation that it benefits the institution. We're shifting the focus from just cost reduction to more and more value creation. How can we have more and more impact in the marketplace and within the organization to create more value for the marketplace? Now, all of a sudden, how can we get even more workers doing that? We don't have enough. There's more and more value to be created. So our sense is that it is a challenging shift. Don't want to underestimate it at all. But on the other hand, it's something that already is happening. And I think one of the things in our research, we do case studies to support the research. And Maggie can talk to some of the examples that we've come up with in terms of companies and institutions that are already starting to redefine work in the way we're talking about.
I'm sure a lot of companies will say, we're already doing this. We're all about the customer experience. We're all about, tapping into the potential of our employees. I mean, we see that kind of language scattered across their advertising and their promotional materials. But what you're saying is you're not even anywhere near there yet. Work as a broader picture.
It is interesting because I think there is a sense from some companies that, hey, this is what we already do. We already give power to the workers. We already work in teams. We're already thinking about the customer. And that's true. There has been a shift in that direction in some companies. But if you actually look at where people spend the majority of their time, if you talk to the frontline workers, and as well, if you look at how they're actually being measured and rewarded, you'll see that a lot of it still has to do with task execution that is really done within pretty tight boundaries and with a goal of getting more throughput and being very predictable. And, what we're talking about is actually shifting to something that is, as John said, creating value in an unpredictable world when you don't know what the right outcome is going to be, and that actually be the day-to-day full-time work of people, not something they do kind of on the side or a guideline for them as they go through their everyday tasks, but that they actually are focused on that as their full work.
And I should say a key assumption behind this perspective is that the world, the markets, global economy is changing in a fundamental way. I mean, we used to be in a much more stable environment where you could tightly specify and standardize tasks, and that was the way to be very efficient. In a world that's more rapidly changing, where on a daily basis we're confronting new situations that have never been anticipated, actually that kind of work model becomes very inefficient because now workers are scrambling to figure out, this wasn't in the process manual. How do I deal with this? Again, our belief is it's an opportunity because of the way the world is changing. It's not only an opportunity, it's an imperative. If we continue to just hang on to the process manual, we're going to become more and more inefficient.
I want to really dig into the case studies so we can put a real sort of clear picture on this. And one of the companies that you look at is California-based Morningstar, which is an agribusiness company. It does tomato processing, things like that. They took an interesting approach to empowering their employees. Maggie, what did they do?
Yeah, so the Morningstar company is very interesting. It's easy when we think about redefining work. It's easy to kind of think of it as certain types of workers who could do this more creative, imaginative work and who could be trusted managing their own work. But, the Morningstar company, it's a low-margin business with a lot of low-wage workers. And it's been around for a few decades, so they're a little ahead of their time. They operate on a principle of self-management, so that means no one has unilateral authority over another person. Basically, they let each employee at every level shape their own responsibilities and relationships with their colleagues. And so what this ends up looking like is that there's kind of an assumption of trustworthiness, competence, and the ability to observe and make judgments and act in the interest not just of the company, but really of one's coworkers. They take this responsibility to the company and to their coworkers very seriously. I'll give you just one example that I think kind of brings it to life. One thing they do is they're a pretty aggressive harvester, which means that a lot of vines come in with the tomatoes. So tomatoes get unloaded at the plant. They're kind of floated down this flume of water, and that flume was getting really clogged up with vines and required a lot of sorting. So there was a factory mechanic who'd been there since high school, and he had an idea that a bar that rested across the flume could kind of snag these vines and eliminate the need to sort. And so he was a pretty good welder, so he just welded up a prototype and tested it out on just one flume. And he watched it, and it seemed effective, didn't damage the tomatoes, didn't slow down the flume. So then he pulled in an automation mechanic, just another person in the plant, who helped him to design a small motorized system to automatically dump the vines. And when that proved out, then he kind of shared it with a few other coworkers. They implemented on another couple of flumes, watched it, and only at this point did they actually kind of raise it to higher visibility and suggest that it get implemented in other places. So this is just, one example, but the idea that you see something, you observe for a little while, you try something, you pull in other colleagues informally, try it out again, and keep kind of very responsibly trying to come up with a better solution to it. You know, you never have to make presentations and go seeking approval from management just to try something out. So that was pretty amazing to me.
Yeah, I mean, you can only imagine what it must feel like for them. You know, if they try something out, it works, they iterate on it, and then it becomes something really successful in the company to be able to look at that and say, I made that. That was my idea.
Yeah. And, you know, one thing the Morningstar company does, and you know, this was a company that started out with this vision, and it started out smaller, so they were able to kind of control it. But they hire for people that they think can work in this type of environment. But what they have found is that even in their harvesting teams out in the field, you know, if this is real farm labor, the teams there take it seriously as well, and they'll see like one harvesting team is more productive than another, and so they kind of go out and look and say, what are they doing that's different? And it's because everyone feels the latitude to kind of tweak what they're doing, see what the result is, and then keep looking for a little bit better answers. People tend to stay there for a long time because it is not only effective for the company, it's a good way to work for the people as well.
Well, and what I like about that example is that, you know, oftentimes when we're talking about these kinds of redefining the way work is done, you know, it seems very white collar, sort of knowledge workery. And this is not that. This is something different.
You know, that was, I think, one thing we found that was so affirming and really exciting when we went looking for examples is that you can find different examples in all types of fields. It's interesting to start thinking about what creativity looks like in some different contexts or what imagination looks like in different contexts. Because I think when people push back and say this is only for like a certain type of person, they're viewing what imagination is or what creativity is in a very narrow way, you know, saying, oh, so you mean we're all going to paint pictures and you know, make songs? And it's not that at all. It's really within the context, these things look different.
Sometimes employees are either nervous or afraid of the technology. And let's be honest, you can understand why. Some are afraid that their jobs will go away. Others worry they won't be able to skill up to meet the demands of the future. But if there's one thing we've heard in all of the conversations this year, it's the inevitability that machines and humans will be working side by side, and that each will have a role in harnessing data-driven insights and creating the desired outcomes. On today's show, we heard from An Phillips, who leads research on digital transformation in Deloitte's Center for Integrated Research, and Boston College professor Jerry Kane. He's the guest editor for digital business at MIT Sloan Management Review.